Cooperative Legacy Project interview number 51, August 25th, 2006. We're visiting with Dallas Tonsager, Farm Credit Administration Board member, former South Dakota Farmers Union president, and former USDA Rural Development Director for South Dakota. Dallas, where and when were you born?
I was born June 24th, 1954, in Lake Preston, South Dakota.
Okay. And you have brothers and sisters?
I have two brothers and a sister. My oldest brother, Dennis, lives in Denver. My brother, Doug, runs our farm at Oldham. And my sister, Diane, has been an educator at Mission, South Dakota for the last 30 years.
Okay. Where was your family originally from? We get into ethnic origins here.
Primarily, my roots are in Norway, but I also have a part of my family that came from Luxembourg. My mother's grandfather immigrated from Luxembourg to the U.S. and started the farm where our farm is now. It was called Plainview Farm, and we have named our farm Plainview Farm as well.
Okay. What are some of your earliest memories out on the farm?
Like everybody, I was the youngest kid in the family, so I was always picked on. At least I thought I was.
Do you remember anything from the 50s, or is it into the 60s?
Just vaguely into maybe a little bit in the 50s. I would have been 6 years old at the time. I remember the farm operation, the cow milking, the barn. I have a lot of good memories of it, but I just vaguely remember some of the 60s. I remember when Kennedy was assassinated, some of the 50s. I don't remember Eisenhower as president. That doesn't ring a bell for me. I just remember being a kid on the farm, having a lot of fun.
What was your dad's name?
Gerald. My father was born near he was born in Minnesota. They immigrated to near Lake Campbell and lived there for a while, and then moved to near Oldham, and eventually he bought a farm place after the war near Oldham.
Okay. What sort of a person was he?
Very hardworking. He was a big guy, very strong, well respected in the community. Pretty much worked all the time. Very gentle, soft-spoken with us. He could get angry like anybody else, but he just very diligent. I remember him as always keeping his nose to the grindstone, always working very hard, taking care of us. Wanted to go to town every Saturday night. That was his one indulgence, was to go to the cafe on Saturday night and have a cup of coffee and visit with his friends. Always go to church, but I don't recall... Lutheran, yes, of course. And but he just didn't have a lot of hobbies. He didn't have a lot of outside interests. He just liked to see his friends once in a while and have a good conversation with them.
What's your mother's name?
My mother's name is June. She was born near Oldham. She was one of four sisters. I grew up next door to my grandmother, about 200 yards down the road in the house to their home place. She was the oldest, and she was a teacher. She taught for several years. After they got married, she no longer taught, but she raised the four of us, and she did a lot of work on the farm.
Do you think, did your folks belong to cooperatives over there?
Sure. Tri-County Union Co-op was the local supply cooperative in Oldham. The Oldham Farmers Elevator, my dad was on the board of directors of that. That was the grain elevator for the community. Dad was on the local Farmers Home board in the county for some years. We had those two co-ops. The rural electric provided the power. And then, you get the regular regional co-ops, and I remember them going off to the GTA meeting every year. That was their thing.
Okay. One of the questions that I ask people who are somewhat older than you is about their memories of the 1930s. Did your folks talk about the 1930s a lot? They certainly remembered them.
They did. They didn't talk about them a lot. They were still in the growing up years during that time frame. Very, very tough period. I mean, certainly many of the farmers around there had homesteaded there, had done all the work developing their farms there, put together a little money probably during the periods before that. But basically, you know, they I think were all in a collective boat together during that time around our community and hung together pretty well. So I don't recall any stories of people going hungry in that sense, but I think it was profoundly impacted on their future thinking about how they spent money. They did not waste money. It pressed their work ethic to make sure that they, to avoid risk to a very large extent. And so I think it had a huge impact on them. And, of course, they reference those hard times a lot,
What about the other event from that general time frame that influenced a lot of people, World War II? Did you folks talk about that much?
My father was in World War II. He had a tank. He and a group of guys had this tank. It was called a tank destroyer. He went into the military, trained at the various, I think it was Fort Hood, if I recall correctly. They went overseas. They prepared in England. He went on the beach at D-Day plus 5 or 6, I believe, so he wasn't that day. But he took his tank all the way through Normandy, through the Battle of the Bulge, into Germany, and was heavily involved in many major actions. He won the Bronze Star, but he never talked about it. I mean, he was very, very closed-mouthed about that period of time. And it's only been really in recent years that, we've gathered some information. There was a history when they discharged them and they wrote down the things they were involved with and gave that to them. And his tank division shows up in some tank histories. He had his unit, I think it was a battalion. No, it was a smaller unit than that. But anyway, there is, I'm able to track some of the battles he went through and things like that. But he never really talked about it, and he was over there and came back and proposed to Mom when he got back, essentially.
Okay. Your hometown over at Oldham has a long cooperative history. I think there's even, I think it's today known as a social hall. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
It wasn't the original one, right?
No, certainly. If you go to Prairie Village, there's a large steel-clad building structure with this. I can't remember the exact description of what they call the kind of metal, but it's formed metal and it's around the building. And they moved that building from Oldham, and I watched them load it up and move it probably in the 60s, maybe the 70s, to Prairie Village. And it still sits there today. It served as a home for Prairie Repertory Theater for many years, and now I still think they occasionally use it for some events, but it's open to go into. Anyway, if you look above the door, it says Social Hall, but if you look closely, the letters IST have been chiseled off, and so it was the Socialist Hall, and it became out of style, of course, probably in the 40s and 50s, and that time they changed it to the Social Hall, and it sat empty for many years before they finally moved it, so we were really, really glad that got it reinvigorated when it got moved to Prairie Village and refurbished and redone and served a good purpose after that.
We talked a bit about your family's involvement in cooperatives. How about Farmers Union?
My grandfather, Chris Smershes, was very active in the Farmers Union. I got a gift my mother gave to me was his 25-year pin as a member that he got sometime, I believe, in the 40s. So he was actively involved in the Farmers Union very much during the early stages of the organization. I don't recall if my grandfather Tonsager was involved or not. He may have been, but I remember that my grandfather Mershes was involved with it heavily. And, of course, a lot of the neighbors. There was, like a lot of small communities, there was a Farmers Union local that people were involved with.
Mm-hmm. Do you, I guess this is another question that I've asked a lot of folks. Do you think there was a particular affinity for cooperatives among people of Scandinavian descent?
It would seem that way. Certainly the people around our community are predominantly Scandinavian. And, I suspect it's part of the heritage that came out of that period and out of those ethnicities that people grew up with, and I think still exists very strongly today in Europe. But, that's my impression. I mean, I remember growing up through that period, co-op meetings were part of the agenda every year for everybody, and everybody showed up and they participated in them. And so, yes, I think that would be a fair statement.
Mm-hmm. You had a rather famous neighbor over there, Emil Lorix. You want to talk a little bit about Emil?
Sure. We grew up, Emil's place was about 3.5 miles from where we lived. He was well known in the community, kind of legendary in that sense. Everybody knew he had run the Farmers Union. Everybody knew he had run for Congress. Everybody knew that he was the GTA guy, been chairman of the board for very many years. Everybody knew he was very outspoken, and I got to know him better later in life. For him, he passed away, I believe, on Christmas Day, and he was 90 years old or thereabouts, and that would have been in the late 80s, if I recall correctly. I have a pretty good story about him. He that come through that period, and we had a farmers union meeting, and I was probably county president or something at that time. I guess I would have probably been state vice president at the time. But he was very anxious about what was occurring, and he had written a letter to the President Reagan at the time, and he got a response from President Reagan, and he brought the letter to the meeting we had, and he analyzed, of course, sentence by sentence, practically the response he got from the president. Very sharp, very, very on target. And he had enjoyed the meeting, and he told me he'd enjoyed the meeting. And then Christmas Day came, and I heard that he had passed away. Oh, I take that back. First of all, I've gotten this letter from him just before Christmas, thanking me for the meeting and all of that, and it was handwritten from him. And he passed away on Christmas Day, and I'd thrown the letter away. I'd read it and just didn't thought too much. But I went back out and dug it out of the garbage and framed it, and now still have it today as kind of a memento of the time, because he talked about the loss of all the farms in the letter, and it became a very, very interesting piece. Interesting, in later years, I happened to have a conversation with Governor Janklow, who he became friends with Emil, and he had a very similar experience. He received a handwritten letter from Emil about Christmas just right after he died. Apparently, Emil sat down and wrote a bunch of people, probably knew he was dying, and decided he wanted to contact some people at the time. So that left quite an impression on me, from that time period. Emil was a firebrand. He was smart. He was a debater. He was, all those things that many of us remember about him, and totally dedicated and committed and sincere in everything he did. And so, a remarkable person.
Mm-hmm. Did knowing him have an influence on you and what you got involved in eventually?
Sure. I think very, very much so. A number of people had influences on me. My family was Republican, quite conservative, and in that sense, but certainly not conservative in the sense we think of some conservatives today. But I grew up in a conservative environment, and that was a period that people I think a lot of the Farmers Union and a lot of other folks were taking a much more liberal view to the world, and so. Emil's, I think, very strong words impacted on me, along with many others. I had just been in, not too long out of college, and had become more liberal during that period, and Emil kind of reinforced that with me.
Where did you go to school at? Did you go to country school, or was it you were always in town? I
was a town school kid, 250. Town of 250. We had a school. My class was one of the largest. It was about 25. Graduated in 1972 and went to South Dakota State University. I had planned to go to diesel mechanic school at Springfield, and 2 weeks before school started, I changed my mind and decided to go to South Dakota State, and registered at the last minute and got involved going over there, and ended up focusing more on farming than on mechanics at the time.
Well, you think that made a big difference for you? And obviously, I can't imagine you as a diesel mechanic.
It was a very huge thing. It made a huge difference for me in the decision to switch at that time. And I enjoyed South Dakota State. I think of it as a great school. I was not that good a student, but I made a lot of relationships during that period that had a big impact on me in the future. 1974, I decided to do some volunteer work for George McGovern, who was running for the Senate again that year, and went down to the local Democrat office in Brookings and got on the phone. And the local coordinators were Tom and Lori Daschle. And so got to know them briefly at that time, and of course ran into them in later times. Got active with the Democrats. Went to a Democrat convention and met a young guy named Lee Swenson who had come there to represent Farmers Union or some such interest at that time. And quite a few folks that I still maintain relationships with that have turned out to be legislators or involved in a number of things, including one young man in my bowling class with me was named Mike Rounds. And so Mike and I and two young ladies took a car out every Wednesday afternoon for our bowling class, and I got to know Mike a little bit back then. And he also was a baseball player along with my roommates, so we became acquainted back at that time.
Okay. Going back a little bit earlier than that, what did you want to do? You mentioned diesel mechanics, but I'm guessing maybe it was relative to the farm, or was it?
Yeah, I gradually became more and more focused on farming and expected to have that as a career entirely. My father did me the good favor and did that for each of us in our family to allow us as we got older to actually operate like 100 acres of land ourselves. And so I think the first year I did it was when I was 14, and that was my turn to get my brothers and sisters. Doug and Diane were 5 years older than I were. So he allowed us each to kind of accumulate some assets. We got to pay our own way through college, and we earned enough money off our farming operation to do that. So I had 100 acres to farm when I was 14, decided what crops to plant, got to use the farm equipment. Then he wanted us to get involved in livestock, so what money we made in crops, we invested in Holstein heifers and raised those up, sold those, or kept them for the dairy, and gradually accumulated some assets. So by the time I got to college, I was pretty invested in farming. Wasn't completely committed to farming going to college, but spent the first year or two in kind of general enrollment, and then more specifically in mechanized agriculture-related courses. They weren't quite engineering courses. They were, design of farm equipment, management of farm equipment, all the associated mathematics with that. And so, but by the time I graduated, I had entirely planned to farm and was... we were only 30 miles from Brookings, so I pretty much farmed every weekend. I don't think I spent 2 weekends in Brookings in 4 years, unless it was a really bad blizzard or something. I usually ended up home on the weekends farming.
Mm-hmm. You majored in ag business?
It was called mechanized agriculture, and I had a minor in economics.
In economics, okay. I was wondering about your minor. That's
what
I was trying to get to. Are there professors that you remember that had an influence on you from college?
3 or 4. I had two advisors. I'm sorry, I'm Dr. Arnold, who later became, I think, the acting dean of the College of Ag for some period. But Dr. Arnold was my first advisor there, and then a guy named Harvey Young was my advisor during the mechanized ag classes. I also had some political science courses I took. Actually, there's 3 there that had an impact on me. Bob Burns, who of course is still there and is the head of the political science department. Herb Cheever, who became good friends with us. Herb was the dean of arts and sciences for a while, and we became close friends with them. And then I'm sorry, I have to stop and think for just a moment. It's a shame I can't say his name. a gentleman who ran the state and local government program for many years there. I'm sorry, I'm spacing off on his name. It's very frustrating to me. Hendrickson, Dr. Hendrickson. I'm trying to say his first name, and unfortunately, I'm spacing off on it. He was kind of the guru of state and local government. Was one of Senator Daschle's teachers, and he had a real impact on me relative to state and local government issues.
Mm-hmm. You graduated when?
1976.
Okay. And when did you meet your wife?
I met Sharon when I was a senior at South Dakota State University in the fall. I should back that up. I probably met her in about 1974. She was a roommate to my cousin Laura Lee at Augustana College. And Laura and I were very close, and Sharon was her roommate, and I'd met her once or twice. And then that fall of 1975, while I was still in college, we started to date. We dated through the time I was a senior, and then the following fall, Sharon was young, 1 year behind me at Augustana. In the fall of 1976, I asked her to marry me, and we got married in the summer of 1977. So. Okay.
And you got a couple kids, but we'll try and get to them a little bit later on in that interview. Mm-hmm. When did you become involved with cooperatives yourself after you got out of college?
My first involvement, a few things happened in that time frame. I was asked to be on the local board of the Oldham Farmers Elevator. My father had been in that board seat, and then when he left the board, they asked me to consider it, and I took that. About that same time, I went up to a Harvest States GTA convention at that time in Minneapolis, and I ran across a guy I'd met previously, Leland Swenson, and he was there with Emil Oryx, and sat down and chatted with them, and then about a few months later, Lee gave me a call, kind of got me involved, and I think it was probably a year or so after that, Lee started a thing called the South Dakota Dairy Task Force, because I was a dairy farmer. He asked me to be the chairman of it. I got actively involved with that and had a committee. We met for the first time out in Pierre. You were probably there, I would guess, for it. Almost got killed on the way out in an automobile accident at that time, but we had our first meeting, got very involved with it. Went out, did some testimony on the dairy issues, became an officer in the County Farmers Union, county president, and then eventually competed against Mike O'Connor to be state vice president, lost to Mike, came back a year or two later and won the thing, and then Lee, of course, became president of the National Farmers Union. I moved up.
Mm-hmm. You were also involved with Land O'Lakes.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Land O'Lakes had and still has a cheese processing plant in Volga, and their process is a little different than most of the co-ops we think about. They had a voting unit board, so the Volga area was a voting unit, and they had an advisory board, and so I was again asked to consider running for that. I did, and became a member of the advisory board for the Volga area voting units. Started to go to some of the Land O'Lakes conventions as well. Had a term limit, if I recall correctly, so I think I stayed on there for maybe 6 years as a voting unit board member. They followed a little different process. It wasn't. That plant was not run by that local board. It was run by the corporate offices of Land O'Lakes, and we served in advisory roles pretty actively. I mean, they sought our advice pretty actively. But yeah, that's correct.
Okay. What sort of issues were you giving advice to those folks? What sort of issues are they dealing with? Also, the elevator. What kind of co-op issues were you dealing with back in those days? That would be in the early 80s?
Yeah, early 80s, maybe even the late 70s. The Oldham Elevator Board, the elevator itself, a very small co-op. We had, two old elevator houses that were probably dating back 70, 80 years, and with some old tanks. We were doing okay. I mean, kind of getting by. We had, I think, one guy who had a semi who was hauling out of there for us, so we had a real limitation on our capacity to sell grain. We hired a young manager named Jack Nelson, a young local guy, to be the manager, and he was probably in his mid-20s. No, I don't think he was 30, certainly. And he was very aggressive. We built some larger grain tanks, and we added to our capacity. We added some drying capacity, and started to turn some pretty good service for the community, and started to make a little money at it, and add to the dividends that people were getting. So we felt pretty good. That elevator has continued to succeed, has merged with Lake Preston, and has turned out fine. I mean, the capacity to move grain has improved dramatically as we've all grown in our capacities. Land O'Lakes, a lot of our efforts were focused on dairy policy. We had the plant there, and we received reports on the performance of the plant, but we really had no management control over the plant. So we would attend the annual meetings of Land O'Lakes. We'd be involved in the development of policy relative to dairy. I was involved with Farmers Union dairy policy, so I, of course, advocated in that direction. Some of the issues at the time were, of course, the price support program that held the price up. We went through a dairy diversion program, which we advocated for as an organization at that time. I think it was about a 10% reduction in your base dairy in order to try and reduce the oversupply and keep prices up. Eventually, we also went to a dairy buyout, buying out dairy capacity. That probably was too wildly successful. At that time, a number of dairies left business, but a number of them just weren't making it. We were coming into that 80s period when things were very difficult. And so that was probably a good rescue for a number of producers who may have been unable to continue anyway. I also remember very early on some conversations. We had a state dairy, I want to say it wasn't a compact, it was a state dairy program that controlled the relative price of milk. It controlled how much milk was going into Class A and Class B. And I have to be honest, I don't remember all the details anymore. But that was a very controversial program and eventually was eliminated. And if I recall, I can't even remember which side I was on for. I believe I was a proponent for it. Andy Weiss, Dennis's dad over at Flandreau, and I mixed it up a little bit because I think Andy and I were on different sides, whichever way they were. And I remember that was my first involvement with Andy Weiss and the Weiss family back at that time was in getting to know dairy policy. So that was a large subject for Farmers Union, for Land O'Lakes, for everybody surrounding in it. And I was also active in the Democrats, and it came up as an issue in the Democratic Party at that time in their policy statements.
Okay. Are there any other folks that you worked with in relation to the co-ops besides Jack Nelson and Emo, of course?
Well, the manager of the dairy plant in Volga was a gentleman named Garmin Hesby, who was very good and felt very good about his involvement and his understanding of policy issues. Cy Carpenter, of course, was president of the National Farmers Union. We had Cy over to South Dakota a few times during that time for various meetings. Really enjoyed Cy and his ability. Lee, of course, at the time, was getting involved in the organization. Mike O'Connor, Mike's interest in cooperatives and support of cooperatives, and a whole group of people within the organizations. I got to know many of the county presidents and so forth who were avid cooperative supporters and remain so today. I don't know where you'd start and stop on the list of people who've been involved in cooperatives that have been very committed to them and very good at operating those cooperatives.
Yeah, you've talked about Lee Swenson. Pretty influential in your getting involved in the Farmers Union, certainly.
Very much so. Lee really sought me out, encouraged me, supported me. We had many an argument discussion, debate during that time period. Of course, it was a very hot time period for a lot of people in the sense that the farm economy was suffering dramatically. Lee was extremely anxious to be very aggressive in a whole front, a whole bunch of issues to make sure that agriculture survived in the state. And he was, he's always been a passionate person, certainly, but he was extremely passionate at that time, extremely aggressive. He strongly went after the Farmers Home Administration at that time for some of their actions relative to their borrowers. Aggressively pressed members of Congress for financial support for the agriculture community. And we also had the largest rally I've ever been involved with personally in Pierre, South Dakota during that 80s time period that Lee really instigated. A lot of that started with a rally that occurred in Oldham. There was, during that time, that the Oldham School gym, we must have had 800-900 people show up one evening for a rally that was occurring. Lee was one of the guest speakers there that night, and I believe you were there too, if I recall correctly. I think that probably started a lot of what followed in the agriculture community in the state. And, you'd have to say Lee was probably heart and soul of the leadership of that whole effort to try and unify farmers and get them involved in political process and policy development.
Mm-hmm. That was, I think, in February of 1985. That's the same year you ran for vice president. What motivated you to run for vice president?
Part of it was Lee pressing me to consider a run at it, certainly. I also received a call from Carol McKenna. Carol, as many people would remember, was a longtime Farmers Union person, a board member. I was home one evening, and out of the blue, the phone call came, and I knew Carol, of course, and she strongly encouraged me to consider it, to pursue it, and a few other folks did as well. And so, I took a shot. I was relatively new to the Farmers Union. I'd grown up as a Farmers Union member, but never been that active up until I started getting involved with the Dairy Task Force and some of those things. So a lot of the old timers in the organization, a lot of the county president stuff, didn't know a lot about me, and I was trying to persuade them. I got very busy. I went to a lot of county meetings. I strongly tried to make my case and got a very nice reception. But I was up against a tough guy, Mike O'Connor, who had been in the legislature, I believe, previous, or was it after? Not yet. He quit to run for the legislature. That's what it was. Mike had been very active, and his family had been very active in the organization for many, many years, was very well known, and a very good campaigner, a very good candidate, and also a very good friend of mine. He went out and he did beat me. And so, it was fair and square.
Ballots, though, wasn't it?
There was a third candidate, Richard Mosier was the third candidate. And so there was at least two ballots. Richard dropped out, and then it was just Mike and I head-to-head, and Mike won. And so, some mixed emotions. I was glad for Mike, but disappointed not to be involved. Mm-hmm. And then, 2 years later, Mike had decided to step out and run for the legislature and pursued it again and was successful at that time of getting elected vice president. I had some trepidation because I knew Lee was thinking about running for the national president's job as well. So I won in November at the November annual meeting, and then Lee was out actively pursuing the job as national president, and he won that following March in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Mm-hmm. What was your role during that campaign?
I did some traveling, not as much as Lee, of course. I mean, he had, I'm trying to remember what vehicle he had, but he drove it everywhere. He probably put 20,000 miles on it in 3 or 4 months. He drove all over the United States, went to practically every state convention. He campaigned to no end. There was a convention in Utah he couldn't get to, so I flew out there and represented him at that state convention and campaigned for him, got to speak. And I went to some of the surrounding states and did a little bit of work on his behalf. Went down to the convention in Albuquerque and did everything I could. I mean, I think for the 2 days prior to the convention, prior to the election, all of us from South Dakota were pressing the flesh of every individual we could. We had set up our own hospitality room. We popped mountains of popcorn because the smell of that would bring people in the room for the popcorn, and we were slapping stickers on them. We were working diligently, I think all of us tirelessly for him during that time. And eventually, of course, won by the equivalent of 4 people's votes. That he just barely was successful.
So he is elected, and if I remember correctly, he assumed the national presidency almost immediately.
Yeah, we got home, called a board meeting, I think, for the following week. Lee came to it. He went to his office, loaded his stuff up, waved at me, and said goodbye. No, it wasn't quite that simple. We, of course, communicated a lot by phone and interchanged. But he, of course, had to get on with his job, and was just extremely anxious to start it, to get to Denver, to get going. And we had about a 6-hour transition one day where we talked, and then he was out the door.
So you're suddenly acting president.
Yes. That was a term we used.
You didn't initially expect to be president, if I remember correctly. You looked toward finding somebody else to take the job.
That's correct. I was a full-time farmer, had my dairy, didn't have any experience in managing the farmers' union or a large organization in any way, shape, or form. And so, I thought it would serve the organization best if we could identify, perhaps somebody else that could serve in that role. And so I was doing the work. I got up in the morning at the farm and did the milking. I drove over here, spent the day here, then I'd get home in time in the evening, generally to do some of the milking then too. So it was a very, very full day for me. And, of course, spring would be coming on soon, and planting and all that business. So I started doing some interviews and met some interesting people during that process. But I also found the work more and more interesting, and it was intriguing to me. I liked the staff at the organization, got to know them pretty well, but gradually kind of started to turn around and to like the idea of being engaged with it and do the work at it, and thought I can contribute to it. So I gradually changed my opinion. The board was very supportive and very helpful. They understood when I first decided not to. I didn't think I was going to do it full time. They didn't really want to switch to a part-time president, so they were pressing me to keep my, see if I couldn't do both, keep my farm but still commit enough time to the operation. Put a lot of pressure on my brother and my farming family, because it was very hard to get all the work done between us and do all that. So we had a couple of difficult years of transition, but eventually I started to minimize my involvement with the farm, and more became actively full-time working farmers union, and I worked, did the lobbying each year pretty much full-time during that period, and the national organization started to consume a lot of time during the course of my presidency. I think one time I figured I spent a month in Denver a year, a month in Washington, and 2 months in Pierre. And that became the norm towards the end of my term.
Mm-hmm. Who did you run against when you ran? You decided to run in the fall of 8. That was like to fill out the last year of Lee's term?
No, Lee would have, let's see, how was it? I think I had to run twice. It would have been 1987 when Lee won the national job, and I had to, I believe, run that fall to fill out the term for 2 years, and then I had to run again the following year for my next term. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me in the fall of 87 I ran so I can complete the term, because I could only be president until the convention, And then the following year was for a new full 2-year term for myself. And to be honest, I can't remember. Cliff Gascoigne ran against me, but I can't remember if it was in fall of 87 or the fall of 88 that it occurred.
I think it was 88.
I think it was 88.
Yeah.
So I must have got a pass in 87 without opposition. And then Cliff made the decision to run in 88, yeah.
Yeah, you had a vice president elected. Do you want to talk about your vice president? I think he was vice president throughout your term.
I was fortunate. I had the same board of directors the day I started. I must not have had Cecil that day. Cecil Hall was the elected vice president in the fall of 87, so I didn't have Cecil until, I don't believe, I've got to stop and think about that. I may not have had Cecil until the fall of 87 as vice president. And I want to say Michael Connor was still vice president, or was the vice president. No, I can't remember correctly.
You had replaced him as vice president.
Yeah, I replaced. Okay, so the vice presidency was vacant. Mm-hmm. That's what it was. But all the other members of the board were the same, and they were a wonderful group of people. I just thought the world of them. We had kind of an eclectic view on things between us. I mean, people had different perspectives. But we made decisions, and everybody stuck to those decisions. And I felt tremendously blessed by that because we could have a very good, strong discussion on an issue. But when we walked out, we were almost always united and supportive of each other and the position we decided to take. And so I am extremely grateful to the board of directors I had at that time, and especially to Cecil, who is this very distinguished man who is very thoughtful, very people respected automatically upon meeting Cecil, and I still have the greatest affection and respect for him. He just did a very nice job, somebody who is completely trustworthy, and was remarkable in that sense.
One of the main issues confronting the organization during those initial months was a ballot issue involving non-family farm corporate ownership of hog production facilities. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about that campaign a little bit?
Sure. There had been a significant effort to build a very large pork operation north of Pierre by the company at that time known as National Farms. And National Farms, I believe it was going to be 30,000 sows that were going to be producing pigs, and the feeding operation associated with that. It became very controversial. Of course, the people in Pierre were concerned because of environmental issues, especially odor. They felt that there would probably be a strong drift from the smell of that. Farmers Union was concerned because of the economics of what that meant. First of all, consolidating 30,000 pigs into one spot meant a private corporation who had significant advantages relative to tax policy. At that time, we had things called investment tax credit, rapid depreciation schedules. They had a whole lot of economic issues that producers in South Dakota thought were going to be very negative to them, that would lead to a reduction in the prices for their hogs. And so there was a strong economic objection to that. A group involving Farmers Union, the pork producers, and several other organizations was formed with Farmers Union's leadership to initiate a ballot measure to stop that. And so just when I came on board, that measure was evolving at that time. If I recall, we had it on the ballot in 1988. It had been approved in 1986. Am I saying that, Chuck?
No, I think it was on the ballot in 88.
The ballot in 88. Yep. Okay. So we went through, that's correct. We went through the campaign. Farmers Union committed funds. We raised funds. We hired some media consultants. We put together a pretty big campaign on billboards in Sioux Falls to point out the importance of this issue. And that was, I think, the first big event that involved an alliance between those involved with environmental issues and those interested in the economic policy that went along with the development of very, very large farms. And so there's a lot of state history going back to that point that has really been played out over a 20-year period, and probably for 10 years prior to that. The development of the Family Farm Act in the 1970s was the precursor, of course, to this amendment that was directly aimed at strengthening the Family Farm Act at that time.
And that campaign was successful in the fall.
It was successful in the fall of '88. You're right. I had to stop and think about my dates a little bit, but you're correct. It was successful by a strong margin, and it really, I think, chilled the whole idea of very, very large corporations developing processing plants in South Dakota.
Mm-hmm. At some point, and you, I guess you partially addressed this, it became more difficult for you to serve as president and a full-time partner in the dairy farm. When did you and Dennis decide to get out of the dairy farming business? Was it Dennis, your brother?
I have a brother, Dennis, but it was my brother, Doug, that worked with me on the farm. And so we continued to farm through the early 90s, the dairy farm. The farm, of course, exists today, and I'm still involved with. Sure. But the dairy, we went through the early 90s, probably quit in about, I want to say 91 or 2 in that time frame before we just hung it up. And we liked the dairy. We liked the good paycheck that came with the dairy. We struggled a little bit like everybody else when times were hard. But we decided we could live without it. And so we sold the dairy herd off, and we went to we kept some heifers for a while, some dairy heifers we kept feeding. Eventually it evolved to my brother had some beef cattle, and we split the crop operations between us. And I helped as I could on the crop operations. But it evolved so, our general recognition that I was going to be engaged in other things, and Doug was going to be the manager of our farm.
Dairying has a tendency to be, I don't know whether you would call it labor intensive, but somebody needs to be there in a way that's not the case with crops all the time.
The term labor intensive is very appropriate, and it was very much that. And anybody who's been engaged in that knows what it means.
Another key issue during those years was, of course, tax policy issues, and I think the first of those was Dakota Proposition 2.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the Dakota Proposition came out of the efforts that occurred in California to put caps on property taxes. And a group of people in South Dakota began to instigate that limitation. If you recall, the time was very hard economically. People were suffering in the 80s financially. Property taxes were relatively high. The state did not have a balanced tax system in that they relied on sales taxes and property taxes as a primary financing of the state's tax system. And property taxes were kind of a wide open subject. If you needed, if there was a public entity that needed more financing, they could raise the mill levies. And there was not much restriction on what they could do to raise the capital they needed. The state's budget was limited because they were restricted by growth and sales taxes on what they could provide. And so the Farmers Union family or organization was very interested in restricting property taxes. And they weren't so much opposed to government services being provided as they were having a very strong belief that the state's tax system was not fair. And so the approach we took into the issue with the people that evolved the initiative was to say, okay, yes, we're going to support this initiative. We are, however, advocates for income taxes. And so we will support you, but we will advocate for income taxes. And so that's what we did. We continued that. The ballot measure was fairly close. It did fail on the tax limitation that was to occur. Educators were very, very concerned about it because it was going to directly impact on education. And they took an opposing view because of the failure to identify a revenue source to replace the funds with. After the failure of that, we started a group. We helped lead that to try and negotiate some agreement regarding taxation between the various organizations that had interest in that. The state legislature, the governor appointed a committee that began to meet to talk about taxation during that time frame. We continued our advocacy for an income tax and reduction in other taxes. And that, of course, led to the next ballot measure that was brought.
It was kind of a long process of discussion before you finally decided on what sort of a proposal you're going to come up with and who would be the people supporting it.
Yeah, it was. We were very diligently trying to find common ground with all groups. I mean, we had representatives from almost all the interest groups in the state involved with our committee, and we went to extremes to try and come up with something we thought that everybody could live with. Ultimately, Industry and Commerce, which was the precursor, or State Chamber of Commerce, some other parties simply couldn't live with the ballot issue that we came with and chose to step away from it, and eventually became direct opponents of it.
Mm-hmm. You had to do a petition drive first, though, because this was not, the legislature wasn't going to step in and initiate this for you.
That's correct. The legislature was not going to initiate anything. They were taking a very cautious approach regarding anything relative to taxes. We did have a rally in Pierre and had several hundred Farmers Union members and others show up for the rally. The governor and others came out on the Capitol steps, spoke to us. We took a very aggressive posture on property taxes, and so there was a bit of conflict relative to it at that time. The proposal we came to instituted a progressive personal and corporate income tax at the rate of 2%, 4%, and 6%, with various breaks. I think it was $25,000 and $50,000 and up, relative to the federal income tax. So we thought we had relatively low rates. We thought we had relatively progressiveness built into the tax we were doing. We were going to reduce property taxes by at least 20%. We were going to eliminate the sales tax on food, clothing, and utilities. And we were going to give more direct financing to education. And so that was the package that was developed. We did a petition. We started a petition drive. We made a mistake, and we had to restart the petition drive and had to do some of it over to get the signatures. We did get adequate signatures. We hired some folks to help us with the petition drive, including a young woman named Robin Fry, who just worked tirelessly to get the work done for us.
She was an attorney, wasn't she?
Robin was an attorney and has since passed away, unfortunately. But we had various groups involved, including Farmers Union, the Stock Growers, the South Dakota Education Association. We had, I've got to stop and ASFE, labor union folks were involved with us. And there were several other groups involved, and I feel very bad. I think Dakota Rural Action was helpful to us, and I feel badly for anybody listening to this that I precluded from that, because they were very, very dedicated people that worked on that petition drive, and we led the effort, and we were defeated soundly.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that happened?
Well, I think our opponents, of course, there's a lot of things. The root of South Dakotans is not to believe in income taxes. They are not supporters. And I think my view is, at least, that people are misunderstand what the objective by the work is involved in that. It's to achieve more balance. It's not to increase some way to add more tax revenue to the barrel. But it's the idea is to develop the revenue and develop it in a way that is not onerous or any more onerous than it has to be, but to make sure there's some balance. So those, especially those who don't generate a lot of income, who have to work way hard to gain their income, aren't inhibited from growing their wealth. And we tried very hard to achieve that so middle and lower income people could have greater opportunity. We also thought that property taxes were a detriment to economic development, and that industries and businesses that had to rely on heavy manufacturing or other things that were property dependent, including farmers, were being discriminated against, and it was discouraging to those. So the focus was to improve the tax system in the state, hopefully improve the agricultural economy, the rural economy, the economy for those that had to struggle a little bit in that. There were some really good direct economic benefits, too, in the fact that companies who did business in South Dakota, based outside of South Dakota, would pay that tax elsewhere and not here. And that's true today as well. Corporations who do business in South Dakota pay an income tax on the business they do here, and we just choose not to collect it. We tried to make that point time and again. We probably had, I'd say, 50 debates of one kind or another during that time, including on statewide television, local organizations and group, and making our case for the property taxes. But it's just a really easy subject to defeat. I mean, people, the opponents were able to, I think, confuse people, take the focus off, suggest it was just a clever way to burden them with more taxes. We did not have support from state government for our efforts to go that direction, and so it was an uphill battle, and we lost it.
Yeah, you had an explanation, and I seem to remember where you talked about there being two separate issues, one being how much money was going to be raised through taxes, and number two, how much money needed to be spent.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, and certainly I think that there were the financial needs of the state were clear. I mean, it's calculable, it's understandable to come up with a number relative to that, and you can manage your revenue to that number. I think in more in terms, I guess, Chuck, of how much needed to be raised and how it was raised.
Yes.
And and so that, if you needed $1 billion to run government, you could go out and simply assess each person in South Dakota their share of that. But it would be hugely onerous on a very significant percentage of the population that didn't have the wealth to pay it. So I still believe in income taxes as a revenue source. I think I don't know that there's going to be a future. I'd have to say today in South Dakota there is not support for an income tax. I do think people from time to time struggle a little bit with the taxes they pay, and believe that there may be some ways to adjust taxes that are more progressive than what we have today. So, I think the policy issue has to continue to be discussed. I don't know that I'd step up and try and do another initiated measure today, because I think we'd face the same obstacles that we had in the past in doing that. But at the other hand, I can't. Nobody can attempt to deceive the state of South or people of South Dakota and try and bring a tax on without them understanding fully what they're getting into. When we did our initiated measure, I'm proud to say we clearly articulated as well as we could our view about that issue, and I think all the allies in that issue were as upfront with people as they could be. We did not attempt to sneak new tax in the dark of night in the legislative process. We were forthright and brought it to the people's vote.
Let's take a little break here, and we'll continue in a few minutes. Okay, we're back with Dallas Tonsager in part 2 of the interview here. I guess I'd like to move to cooperative relations now. During your time as South Dakota Farmers Union president, they've always been important for Farmers Union. Would you like to talk about how those relationships operated during the time you were president? With the local co-ops and probably with the regional as well?
Sure.
The regionals.
Well, I think that my time as state president was part of a very long-term transition time of the relationship between the Farmers Union Oil Company's elevators and the South Dakota Farmers Union. Certainly, the 40s, 50s, there was a much different kind of relationship than there is today or previously between the organizations. When those organizations were all founded, of course, they had a direct tie to Farmers Union. They used the name, the close working relationships, a lot of mutual people between the boards of directors of Farmers Unions and otherwise. Certainly was a more of a direct financial tie between the checkoffs and the checkoffs and the educational funds that were paid. So, I think that transition, I can't pinpoint it very well, but I would say it must have begun in the late 60s, early 70s, as the economy changes, as co-ops consolidated, as board members shifted, and people, and I don't want to use the term loyalty, but they seem to have taken a different perspective. They wanted those companies to become more bipartisan, and maybe that's not the correct word, because Farmers Union wasn't so much partisan, as it was focused on a certain approach to the economy of agriculture, and other people with different perspectives became involved in those co-ops and managing those co-ops and otherwise. And I think that there has and continues to be kind of a long-term shift that's moved more towards, what's the word I want to use, not bipartisan, but nonpartisan. And again, partisan isn't the correct, be a small p, partisan maybe. They wanted to be politically neutral in the sense of how they advocated for things. They simply wanted to sell their products and do their business and not be tied directly to the Farm Bureau or Farmers Union or anybody else. They just wanted to be there. So that relationship shifted and still shifting. It was shifting during that time. A gradual decrease in the number of checkoffs, a gradual decrease in the educational funds provided, a shift by Cenex, Harvest State, certainly towards a foundation approach which focused on education primarily for funding things and demanded a process of application where you would demonstrate what you wanted to use the funds for and then demonstrate the results for. So, my period during that time was similar to that. You'd have co-ops that were very excited about some of the approaches Farmers Union was taking towards public policy. I think the farm crisis probably inched up the relationships or the ties for a while because people understood there was a need for aggressive approach to agricultural policy. So I think for that period, the cooperatives were probably saying, yeah, we've got to be engaged here. But then after that, I think it's still a gradual trend away from it. I still find today, when I talk to some of the co-op people, a strong interest in Farmers Union, some of the very positive things the organization does in education and in policy and in cooperative development, a strong interest, but not the, I think, kind of the near and dear approach that Farmers Union had between themselves and co-ops when they originally started. So I think if I had to describe that period, I think it's part of an ongoing transitional period that from time to time interest peaks back up among the co-ops and other times it settles back down. And I think I felt pretty good about the relationships we had, but it certainly wasn't as strong as it was in the beginning.
Okay. What were the national issues that stand out? You indicated earlier you spent a lot of time working with National Farmers Union. What were the kind of things you were dealing with at National during that 5-year period from the spring of '88 through the spring of 1993, I guess?
Some of them quite similar to today. I think the big shift that occurred in agricultural policy during that time is the idea of supply management was fundamental to some degree to the government. I mean, we were advocates for supply management, trying to maintain some balance between the supply of agricultural products and the marketplace. We certainly believe that excessive supply drove down prices, and that could be very negative to us as producers. And so we strongly advocated for set-asides of acreages. We strongly advocated for pricing programs that supported the first bushels of production at a higher value than later bushels of production. We were still talking about parity to a great extent and trying to develop an
effort to try to target government support a little bit more toward the family farmers.
Yes, we certainly did. We wanted limitations on payments that focused on that. We wanted limitations on payments and as well as what they could produce to a large extent. So very strongly in a supply control mode. During that time and after my time, it moved away from that entirely. Of course, we went through the mid-'80s, and then coming out of that, I think it was about 85 or 86 where really the government moved to almost unlimited production. We saw prices plummet. We saw the institution of PIC programs where people could, redeem certificates to get additional dollars, and we went through a very deeply subsidized time in agricultural production as we went through that transition, as set-asides went away. The Conservation Reserve Program came along during that period. We advocated for that because we saw it to a large degree as supply management. The environmental community, of course, was excited by it because of preservation of land and reduction of erosion. So the CRP program kind of fell into place during that time, and to a large degree replaced some of the set-aside acres that we had advocated for in the past. So that was probably one of the key areas. We were getting into corporate farm issues to a large extent. We were, adamantly opposing corporate involvement in production agriculture, and so that was frequently part of any debate we had in Farm Bill discussions. I was involved to some degree with commodity trading. I represented National Farmers Union on the Commodity Future Trading Commission Advisory Committee that had been starting up, so I was doing some of the commodity-related issues for the organization, as well as dairy issues and dairy supply management issues that were occurring at that time. There was some international work going on. Lee was heavily involved with the Federation of Agricultural Producers, trying to develop some relationships and trying to bring a progressive approach to those relationships at that time. So there was credit issues. Certainly earlier on, we were still faced with the Farmers Home Administration and other financial institutions pulling away from agriculture. And just as I was beginning my term, the 1987 Farm Credit Act was being implemented, and that modified the way the Farmers Home Administration dealt with individual lenders. And that was a very, very significant thing because it systematized reductions of debt and write-downs and all that structure that was implemented for the next 5 to 6 years that really kind of brought credit back in line with what was possible, what was doable. So, I guess I would describe the period right at the beginning of my term especially as really a volatile one. We were still in the farm crisis. We were still trying to bring some balance back, trying to put a floor underneath the huge exodus from agriculture that was occurring through every approach we could conceive of, and really struggling at that time.
Mm-hmm. What kind of a relationship did you have with Lee Swenson? Here you're dealing with a national president, and you're the South Dakota president. Was that different than, say, the other state presidents in dealing with Lee?
Well, yeah, it was. We were friends. We had gotten to know each other briefly in the 70s, and then again in the 80s. Had one of these long-term dialogues going on between us that we would engage in, almost the drop of a hat. That really was deeply philosophical a lot of the times about what was needed in agriculture, what was needed to end the crisis, what was needed to try and stabilize agriculture. Frequently got into, beyond the philosophical, got into a lot of discussions about the detail of farm program policies, of state policies. Lee, of course, was doing all the lobbying himself with the state legislature, and he was dogged, as you remember, Chuck. You were there quite often. But I remember spending quite a bit of time with Lee in Pierre. He had an old room in an old hotel out there, and he'd share it with anybody that come to town and go out and lobby with him. Yeah. And so, it was a constant dialogue on all kinds of state and national policy issues. And, we continued that dialogue into his national presidency and became constantly engaged with it. So I felt very engaged with that whole dialogue with him. And, of course, he sought out all kinds of people for input. But since we were friends, we had the chance to really continue it. Lee got me involved in the executive committee of the National Farmers Union, on the Farmers Union Insurance Board, the Political Action Committee, and then ultimately on the CFTC Advisory Committee. So, I had the opportunity. I had a great bit of opportunity, probably greater than some others, to be actively involved and get a lot of input in the whole process.
You also had a close relationship with Senator Daschle. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I had a good relationship with Senator Daschle, and still have, I think. Not that I spent a lot of time with the senator, but I had met him in 1974 in Brookings when I was a student, and then I ran into him again in 1977 at the South Dakota State Fair. And he says, I'm thinking about running for Congress. And so I sent him a check for $10 and got a nice handwritten note back from his wife thanking me for one of their very first contributions. And after Tom was elected in 1978, I had him out to our farm at Oldham and had a farm meeting, invited him to come out and had a bunch of farmers in from the community and got talking with them. And it was probably one of his first times out of the chute after he was elected that he came out to our little farmhouse there at Oldham. And then over the years, we just gradually kept up. I was, when I became state president, of course, he was I guess we got to get up to 1986. Lee, of course, was a big supporter of his, and he won a very close race for the Senate in 1986 against Jim Abner, and a lot of it hinged around the status of the farm economy at that time and a very aggressive approach that Tom took, and Lee, of course, being very aggressive and similar, like-minded about farm policy. So Senator Daschle, in retrospect, we look over the career of service he did for South Dakota. There's virtually not an element in rural South Dakota that he didn't have a very significant impact on. We virtually have statewide plumbing, and his fingers are all over so many aspects of Mid-Dakota, Midi-Winchona, Webb. So much of that was directly the results of his efforts. The 1980s, the farm policy, the farm bills that were put into place. I remember when I first became state director of the Farmers Home Administration in the spring of 1993, we went into serious flooding that was occurring in the state. And Mike O'Connor, the state ASCS director, and I were having a conversation at lunch in Brookings one day, and we were trying to figure out how do we address this. There was a formula in place to provide disaster assistance, and the senator was concerned because it wasn't providing enough. And Mike and I talked through the formula about how it functioned, and we noticed that in the formula, you took the 60% of the value of your crop, and you went through, and at the end there was a 0.5. It took whatever the formula calculated for disaster assistance, and it cut it in half. And so we went to the phone by the entrance to the restaurant and called his office in D.C., and they put us right through to him, and we said, Tom, at the end of the formula is a 0.5 that cuts the disaster assistance in half. And he said, and he went down to the floor of the Senate and he moved to remove the 0.5. Well, that directly led to several hundred millions of dollars of additional disaster assistance that year in South Dakota, and saved many farmers and their existence. Frankly, I just time and again that the senator stepped up. Not that others weren't involved, but and nor did Tom ever take single-handed credit for all the work that was done. But I honestly believe there are thousands of farmers in South Dakota in existence, still in business today, that would not be had he not been able to keep in there. Then we talk about ethanol. Ethanol is a 25-year effort that started with Farmers Union, with Ben Radcliffe, with Lee, with others going around the state with a tiny little still with the senator or the House member at that time, talking about gasohol, talking about a little plant at South Dakota State University to kind of demonstrate that you could get it done, going through ups and downs and struggles, and every single time for a 25-year period, the senator constantly stepped forward to make sure that ethanol was on the agenda, that it survived, that it squeaked along, that people that needed the money to keep studying it, keep working at it. And today we have an absolute, probably the biggest economic event in our state's history is ethanol. Billions of dollars are being put into the ethanol business. Billions of dollars are coming out in income, improved price for corn, a shift away from dependence on foreign oil. All of those things that all of us, including the senators' advocacy for all of those years, are coming to fruition, and in a very big economic way. So I frankly will, with due respect to Senator Thune, I frankly do not understand how the people of South Dakota could choose to give up what the senator's done for them. I simply do not understand the vote that occurred relative to giving up that effort.
Then we come up to the 1992 election, and Bill Clinton, probably surprising some people, being elected president. When did you seriously start thinking? Well, you actually went down to Little Rock on election night.
Yes, we did. I was skeptical of Bill Clinton early on, and which is rather ironic under the circumstances. But Clinton absolutely, as a candidate, as a political driving force, made himself almost unstoppable. I mean, he beat a number of very strong candidates for the presidency. We had a very popular Republican president as little as 2 years before the election who had just won a war, who was in a very strong political position. But Bill Clinton became an incredible force. And I really, it was summer of 1992 before I really believed that he may well become president. Because, and if you recall, we had Ross Perot's involvement in the election at that time, and he was quite volatile on his approach to the election. There was a huge up and down. And but I went to a National Farmers Union board meeting in Washington, D.C. The Political Action Committee met, talked about endorsements, seriously looked at Ross Perot during that time as a candidate to be reckoned with. A number of South Dakotans got involved in that discussion that eventually led to the Farmers Union's PAC, not the board, but the PAC endorsing Clinton. And Clinton, of course, went on to be successful in that election. And, yeah, we went down election night, and it was extremely exciting. It was like a huge shift in direction for the country. And here was this bright young guy who had terrific charisma and was open to almost all ideas. So I had the election was over, and I was state president, and I got a call from an old friend named Rick Weiland, who was Senator Daschle's state director at the time, and he says, "Dallas, I think you should consider the job running the Farmers Home Administration." And I immediately said, "No, thank you." I just really kind of liked Farmers Union and was pleased with what I was doing and kind of happy to be doing it. But then I went home and talked over with my wife for a weekend, and I called Rick and said, well, maybe we better at least consider this. And I felt really fortunate because I competed against some very, very strong candidates, wonderful people, good friends that were extremely well respected. And so I felt very fortunate when it was all said and done that I got the chance to be in the administration and to run Farmers Home, which eventually became rural development during that time.
What were your expectations when you took the job at Farmers Home? Obviously, its main emphasis at that time, at least, was probably on farm loans.
Yeah, and that was, really 90% of the attraction for me was the chance to go into an agency that really Farmers Union had challenged strongly in the 80s, especially, and that had, I think, been through tremendous ups and downs. Now, I didn't hardly know anybody at all in Farmers Home. I had met some of the previous state directors, including Marvis Hogan and Dexter Gunderson and some others that had been in those roles. But I came in the door at Farmers Home not maybe having met one or two of the employees previously beyond the state director and not really knowing what to expect to a large degree. So my expectations were kind of like I wasn't sure what I was walking into. And I spent probably the first couple months just trying to get a sense of scale. I asked 10,000 questions. I wanted to understand the status, especially of the current actions against farmers on their loans, to know how many people were still delinquent, who were still struggling, who didn't have adequate financing. We had a couple hundred cases of borrowers who were really in legal trouble. I mean, they had taken actions that were way out of the scope of being legal, and so we had to deal with those kinds of cases. They were still implementing the 1987 Credit Act to a large degree. There were still a lot of things that were occurring relative to that, how we conducted write-downs. There was still a lot of frustration in the farm community because credit seemed to be very onerous. And there was people who weren't Farmers Home borrowers that were angry at Farmers Home borrowers at that time, because many of them were able to get loans and buy property that the non-Farmers Home borrowers thought they deserved to get access to. So the implementation of some of the young and beginning farmer stuff at that time was impacting negatively, and so we had to struggle with that. But there was $1 billion of outstanding credit in Farmers Home in South Dakota at that time. There had been several $100 million of write-downs, and so we had, the first few years were really dominated by dealing with credit actions on individuals, foreclosures, and other kinds of actions that had to be taken care of. We tried to do some positive things by implementing some more beginning farmer programs and some that were sensitive to getting them off the ground, getting them started. We tried to alleviate some of the pressure on existing borrowers, and so the first few years were pretty dramatic in that sense.
What sort of process was involved in shifting some of the responsibilities that had been part of your agency over to what became the Farm Service Agency, which had been the Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service, and then, of course, the establishment of your agency as Rural Development? What was that, about 1995? When did that happen?
It's 94, 95, in that time frame. Congress and the administration had made a decision to reorganize USDA for a lot of very good reasons. They wanted to become more customer-friendly. That was their goal, and that was the primary focus. And they wanted to have the various areas more mission-focused. And I was invited in, along with about 4 or 5 other state directors, to hear a presentation by the Farmers Home staff about how the new agencies would look. They wanted to create the Farm Service Agency, and they wanted the lending functions of Farmers Home to move to that for farm credit. Then they wanted a rural development mission area that would improve the economies of rural America, both related to agriculture and non-agriculture. The acting undersecretary at that time was Mike Dunn, who had previously been the national administrator of Farmers Home, and before that, of course, had been run the Washington office of Farmers Union, and was an old friend of mine. But I went in, and a gentleman named Carl Stauber, who is the assistant undersecretary, asked us to hear a presentation and report to them on it. The proposal was to create this really Washington-centered process that was going to be stovepiped, and the 3 agencies of the Rural Utility Service, Rural Housing Service, and the Rural Business Cooperative Service would all have their separate staffing out into the field and all this. And I wrote a very strong letter to Carl about how I thought that was just not functional. It just wouldn't work well. That basically it took the state directors out of the function, the local control out of the function, was really inefficient. And I went home to South Dakota, and suddenly I got a call from Carl, and he was furious, and I thought he was mad at me, but he was mad at his staff for what they presented to us. And eventually he made me chairman or co-chairman of the committee that did the restructuring and reorganized nationally the Farmers Home, created the Farm Service Agency and Rural Development. And so we went through about a year of putting together the plan. They eventually established the two agencies. We basically created a separate farm credit division in Farmers Home, and then we transferred them as a group to the old ASCS and created the Farm Service Agency. So I got a lot of great stories we could talk all day about, the ups and downs and bounces of that. But I spent several months in Washington working on that project and enjoyed it. And it's fun to go around today knowing, when I run into people from rural development, knowing that I was heavily involved in the restructuring of the agency back at that time.
Mm-hmm. And so were you happy with the new role of your agency? Because initially, of course, you had a lot of interest in helping to get young farmers started.
Yeah, I missed the farm credit work because there was some opportunities there. I did agree with the reorganization. I think it made a lot of sense. The rural development mission really intrigued me, however, and I've always had, just as Farmers Union has this triangle as its symbol where you have cooperation, education, and legislation, I always strongly felt that the long-term importance of the development of new cooperatives, especially value-added processing ventures, was very important. And so I liked the other elements we were doing. We were doing water and sewer systems, and we were working with Native Americans, and we were doing housing, and we were doing all kinds of different programs. I think we had almost 30 programs we were operating. But the intrigue of trying to create these new ventures was really attractive to me. And so I made that one of my major focuses in trying to fund different projects, ventures, the creation of the Value Added Development Center, making sure they got resources, get off the ground, get started, and started to fund some of the various proposals that were being put forward for ethanol plants and other kinds of ventures. So that was very exciting to me, and I really liked the work. I had a smaller staff. I had a very bright group of people I was working with, and so I would say the transition turned out to be very good for me, and I was really pleased with it.
And one of the other initiatives you had was something that, well, it resulted in BASIC, the Beetle and Spink
Enterprise Community. Enterprise Community.
Enterprise Community.
Mm-hmm.
You want to talk about that a little bit? That kind of still exists, even though the administrations have changed.
Sure. And the idea for empowerment zones and enterprise communities actually were rooted in the Bush administration, but President Clinton took them on and really developed them more fully after that. And the idea was that if you had a community of people who had common goals, common purposes, that if they worked together and developed a plan, you would help to try and fund that plan so they could carry it out and hopefully improve the lives of the people in that community. We went through 2 or 3 rounds of applications for those kinds of things that competed nationally. And a group called Beetle and Spink Enterprise Community, BASIC, developed a plan. It was composed of the eastern half of Beetle County and the eastern half of Spink County. They put together a proposal. They competed for $3 million. There was 10, I want to back up. There was 3 empowerment zones, and empowerment zones in that first round could get up to $75 million apiece, and enterprise communities could get up to $3 million apiece. If I recall correctly, I think there was 3 empowerment zones in that round and 30 enterprise communities, I believe. Beetle and Spink was one of the very first ones that got it, and they put together a revolving loan fund and some other programs that improved the economies of the communities in those areas. And that occurred in about 94 or 95. So they created that. It's still running today, still doing good work, still adding jobs in that area. I'd say on top of that, a few years later, we also did an empowerment zone at Pine Ridge, South Dakota. They were using smaller numbers at that time, and they received $20 million over a 10-year period. And that empowerment zone is still in existence, and they got it in 1998 because their 10 years ends in 2008.
the prime focus of your efforts that involved the Native American community?
There were several other efforts we did relative to Native Americans. We did a lot of housing projects, multifamily, single-family housing. We had to do some special things, including at one point, when you make a house loan on a reservation, you have to go to a federal court to foreclose or take actions on it. We wanted to allow some of the tribal courts to do that, so I had to go to the Attorney General of the United States, Janet Reno, to get approval to start to do that. And so we did make a bit of a shift at that time and tried to work with the tribal courts to that. We did a lot of water and sewer systems on tribal land. President Clinton came here in about 1998. I went to Pine Ridge, and he instructed the Secretary of Agriculture and the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development to do a project there, which eventually myself and our staff developed a lot of the work on and built one of the biggest boys and girls clubs in America at Pine Ridge, the Siouxam Big Crow Center that's established down there. So I feel really good about our work with Native Americans during that time, and there's still lots. There needs to be a long-term relationship between all South Dakotans and Native Americans built, and you can't do it quick. It's going to take a long time.
What were some of the other initiatives you were involved with? We talked about a few of them. Are there other ones that you have to talk about? Yeah,
the other ones I'm really feel good about, there are several, but the development of revolving loan funds. We had a lot of grant programs and revolving loan funds. We worked with a lot of communities and gave them anywhere from $50 to $100 to $300,000 to start a revolving loan fund, to start a business in their community, to give them technical assistance. One of the biggest efforts was with East River Electric Power Cooperative, and they eventually built a $20 million revolving loan fund called the Reed Fund, which does great work today. And that one I'm especially excited about. I think that one's very important. The Minor County Community Revitalization Project, MCCR, which is primarily an effort of the Northwest Area Foundation to put several $1 million into a depressed county. We did some work with that. I think that one's been an important project. There's just any number of things. We did several projects with the South Dakota Farmers Union. Dennis Weiss set up a separate foundation within the Farmers Union to do economic development, and we funded several efforts of theirs that were successful, developed a number of businesses, a number of jobs. So, that was exciting. I'd be hard-pressed to identify all of them, but there was a number of projects that I just really enjoyed. It was a very good job, and I liked that work, and it was a lot of fun.
Yep. Comes the 2000 election, which harkened back, I guess, to some of the elections in the late 19th century, in which we didn't know who the new president was going to be until December, if I remember correctly, of 2000. If Al Gore had been elected president, would you have had any interest in staying on at rural development? Or were you ready to move on to something else at that point?
Oh, I think I would have hoped to have probably moved or stayed on for at least one more term through a Gore administration. And there were several areas I felt we still had work to do in that were uncompleted. And I really would have preferred to have some more time to have completed that work before approaching something different. That was a really torturous time. I mean, it was, when you get engaged in anything, when you get engaged in a federal employment, it's going to end. I mean, eventually there's no question that it will terminate. That one, because of the closeness of the election, the dispute that occurred all over the election, was difficult for myself and all the other political appointees of the Clinton administration and all the other state directors and others in D.C. to know what to do. I mean, we wanted to keep moving forward. We wanted to keep the things that we had started moving, and just kind of being in limbo during that time was a very tough thing. like most things, when they end, you get to move on and do something else, and you find out that there isn't an end of the world. You get to re-engage, and you get surprised where things turn out. And so it turned out as okay for me and for others, but it was just a tough transition.
Mm-hmm. Are there any people you worked with during those years at rural development that you'd particularly like to mention? I think you mentioned Sauber.
Carl Stauber, Deputy Undersecretary for Policy and Planning, who ended up running the Northwest Area Foundation. Michael Dunn, who would run the Washington office of D.C., and who I still get to have a relationship with because he is now a commissioner of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and great fellow. Deborah Matz, who was one of Mike's assistants, I've worked closely with for many years. All the other state directors of USDA Rural Development, there were 50 of us, or 47, I guess, more correctly. Just a wonderful group, articulate, thoughtful, a little rowdy, just a great clan.
How about out here in South Dakota, people work for you?
Oh, yeah, a number of staff in Farmer's Home. Tom Bauer, who ran the farm programs, was an excellent individual. Had a great working relationship with USDA Rural Development, Dwight Woolweber, who ran the housing programs, Bob Bothwell, Tom Kostel, Patrick Gross especially. Pat came to my office from Senator Johnson's staff and was really my key ally in getting the economic development work done. Beyond that, I think the folks in Farmers Union, Dennis, many people took up the rural development agenda and the program and worked very diligently to implement that. The Farmers Union Board was extremely supportive of efforts to do economic and rural development during that time. So, I think they all deserve a lot of credit.
When you left, spring of 2001?
Yeah, I left in February 2001, about a month after the inauguration. We had to move on, and I had pursued a number of things and gotten where I wanted to go directly, but I put out my own shingle and started doing some contract work, especially with Farmers Union folks.
Mm-hmm. Was that Golden Plains?
We called it, to start with, I just did it on my own. It was just Tonsager Consulting. I did a couple of grant writing projects. I got a contract with the Wisconsin Farmers Union and spent the best part of a year developing a blue cheese processing plant over there, which was challenging, but I'm pleased to say is operating and is economically successful. And this past year won the World Award for the best Gorgonzola blue cheese in the world. Also won a blue ribbon for its blue cheese product it makes. And so the people over there were great, and I'm very pleased for their success. I did some lobbying for the National Farmers Union on the Farm Bill and got involved in the rural development sections of the Farm Bill that summer, and eventually partnered up with a gentleman named Tom Hitchcock. I started a company called Golden Plains Ventures, and his was Golden Plains Energy, and we worked closely together for a couple years on different projects that he did the financial work on for me, and I did the development work on.
You were involved, I think, in the process of rural development of the establishment of the Value-Added Development Center.
Mm-hmm.
And that job opened up. When did that happen? When the first director left?
Amy Hempstead Gales was the first director of the Value-Added Development Center. The center is composed of almost every farm organization in South Dakota, with the common goal of trying to improve value-added agriculture. And I think it's been an important element in advocacy and direct activity in creating those ventures. Amy did a very nice job. I'm trying to remember the year it started. I want to say about 98 was the 97 or 8 was the first year. And I believe it was 2002 that Amy moved on. She and her husband moved down to Kansas, and she took a job down there. So the position became vacant. It was coincidental. They asked me to consider competing for the position. The board did. There was other competitors, and I was successful in getting it. It's coincidental that my next-door neighbor and very good friend, Gary Duffy, was chairman of the board of the Value Added Center. Gary was chairman of the Corn Utilization Council, and Gary is the only person that has ever been chairman of the board of the Value Added Center since its inception. And so I got the chance to work with my best friend as my boss, in that case, for a couple years on value-added projects, and it was a great opportunity.
What were some of the main projects you worked on?
We got involved. We especially tried to focus on beef feeding expansion. We started to develop some ventures to try and capitalize some cooperative projects or LLC kinds of projects for cattle feeding. We assisted in some ethanol plants. We didn't directly form them or that, but we assisted in promoting the development of some of the ethanol plants that were going on. We got involved in the development of the now failed Ridgefield Farms project, which was been terribly disappointing to see that not succeed. That was towards the end of my term that started. And so when I left to go to the Farm Credit Administration, it had just kind of gotten off the ground in that. We had worked and done some analysis on several individual existing businesses to see if we couldn't help them get off the ground and get moving. And so we did help with them in the economic analysis in those cases. And we further expanded the Value-Added Development Day at the State Fair, where we had 30 to 40 groups and organizations bringing in the projects that we were assisting with and trying to get them off the ground. Many smaller projects. We got involved in some fish feeding projects that were being developed during the time. Just a multitude of smaller ventures that we were providing guidance and advice on, as well as some grant writing related to USDA and other sources that we were getting money for.
Okay, we come up to 2004 election, and when were you first approached about a possible appointment to Farm Credit Administration?
I was approached in January. No, I take that back. I was actually approached in late 2003 about this by Bart Chilton from Senator Daschle's office, who Bart and I had worked together for an extended period of time. He had worked for Secretary Glickman at USDA and was now working for Senator Daschle. And he asked me to consider it, and again, I was reluctant to, but thinking it through, I thought maybe it was a pretty good opportunity to try and do something important relative to rural America and credit. And so the Value Added Center was probably one of the things that I really loved doing, especially since I get to put projects together and ventures together. But it was also kind of a year-to-year thing, and whether you could get funding or not to keeping it going. And this looked like an opportunity to be really involved on a national level on something that was stable and consistent and important. It was a 6-year term, so I'd have at least 6 years to try and carry out the work that I'd be involved with. So Senator Daschle sent my name to the White House in January or February of 2004 as the nominee. And the process was there's 3 board members, and you have to have at least one from the minority party. So the position was filled at that time, but the term was ending for Mike Reyna, who was chairman of the board, and his term was ending in May of 2004. So the senator sent my name up there in anticipation. The paperwork started, and I filled out all the necessary forms and all that. And then come July of 2004, apparently there was agreement to push several nominees through. And so the FBI came out, did their background checks on me in that time. And then it kind of sat still. We went through the election. Of course, Senator Daschle lost that election, which was disappointing to many of us. But my nomination stayed, and they had a lame duck session of the Senate, and I was approved at the very last hour of the very last day of the lame duck session at 1 o'clock in the morning. Myself and several others, including Mike Dunn, went through simultaneously for approval. So I took up my role the 1st of December of 2004, left the Value Added Center, and started on the Farm Credit Administration.
Okay. What's the role of the Farm Credit Administration Board these days?
Of course, Farm Credit is was 90 years old this year. The Farm Credit Act was signed by Woodrow Wilson back in the first part of the 20th century. It's established, or it authorized the establishment of a series of cooperatives nationwide for providing credit to producers of agricultural products. A series of cooperatives started. The Farm Credit Administration, during most of that time, was not a arm's length regulator. It was really constituted as the federal side of these cooperatives in getting funding, developing the cooperatives, and so forth. For most of its history, that's what it did. It was composed actually of the leadership of the farm credit system. When we came upon the farm crisis in the 80s, the system almost failed. It had not developed probably the right kinds of procedures and policies to make sure that it was making good financial decisions. The farm economy was collapsing, and so it ran into a lot of trouble. Congress decided to restructure the system. It made it a loan, gave it significant several $billion of funds to keep the system going, and it made the Farm Credit Administration an arm's length regulator. So it reduced the size of the board from 12 to 3. It gave it authority to tax the system for its funding, and it gave it the authority to regulate the system and to manage not to manage, but to regulate its process, to examine it, to make sure it was acting in a safe and sound manner. So the agency evolved from that. It has a 3-member board, a bipartisan board. It has a staff. It has a budget. It goes out and examines the institutions, the co-bank, the farm credit banks, the farm credit associations, and it makes sure that the money invested in it by the public through bonds is taken care of in a safe and sound way. Today, it provides about 35 to 40% of the credit to farmers nationwide. It's about $140 billion of outstanding assets, with about $25 to $30 billion of equity investment in it. The system is extremely successful at this point. It's growing at a rate of almost 15% a year, and it's making profits of about $2 billion a year. Much of my role has been to, of course, learn in the first year or two about the system, but to also look at ways the farm credit system can help develop rural America, along with making sure it stays safe and sound. But is there ways that we can add capital to rural America in a safe and sound manner that improves the lives of all rural Americans? And the system is starting to do that. It's doing more in the housing area. It's doing more in utilities, rural electrics, water systems. And it's beginning to do some more in value added. It right now has funds in over 40 ethanol plants and a few $1 billion invested in those areas. So right now it's a very exciting time because I'm being able to engage with a successful farm credit system and advocate for it to do some of those things that I like in rural development. So we're opening some doors for the farm credit system to be engaged more deeply in rural America and take up, I think, in some ways where the federal government hasn't been as engaged in recent years. The farm credit system is starting to become more engaged.
Is the organization the same in all parts of the country, or are they a little different in various areas?
It varies widely. The credit to farmers is delivered through about 95 farm credit associations. Each of the associations belongs to a farm credit bank. The farm credit bank raises capital for them and provides them with the funds necessary to make the loans. And in some cases, the banks make large loans, like to utilities and others. CoBank, of course, is the leading entity for making farms or loans to cooperative institutions and for utilities in other areas. It is very different. Some associations are very small and might be $100 million in their scale. Some associations, like Farm Credit Services of America, cover 4 states and have $9 billion of assets. So there's a real eclectic approach to it in how they do. We've been advocating for, and more associations are providing dividends and allocating capital to their patrons, which has not been the case for some time in many areas. Many associations coming out of the 80s were fearful of not having adequate capital, so they stopped paying patronage and stopped allocating earnings. And I think that's unfortunate to some degree, because I think people don't realize that they're involved with a cooperative institution quite often because they just don't relate to it. So I hope we're bringing about a shift back towards allocation of earnings, allocation of dividends, and being more of a cooperative association than one that just simply grows.
You have a 6-year term, if I'm correct. What sort of impact would you like to have when you're done?
I'd like to, number one, be able to say that the farm credit system is safe and sound, that we've made sure that the system will be there should there be another agricultural crisis, that there's enough strength there that we don't have to pull back from providing credit across the board. I would like to be able to say that the system is broadly engaged in rural America and making economic activity happen, that there is more opportunity in rural America because the system is engaged in that. I would like to be able to say that the system is working closely with other lenders in rural America, banks and others, which doesn't occur all the time now, that there's a lot of competition, a lot of hard feelings between those. And those would be it. I would also like to say that the system is dealing fairly with all minorities and all of those groups that don't always have access to credit. That's important to me. I believe by and large it is happening correctly now, where people are having equal opportunity. There may be instances where it doesn't happen, and I'd like to do my best to make sure that wouldn't continue. So if those things all occurred, I'd feel pretty good about it.
Mm-hmm. So you're dividing your time these days between living in the Washington, D.C. vicinity and getting out to the various around the country, and a little bit of time back here in South Dakota.
And we try to maintain a home here. We're not here a lot, but I travel a lot. I've been, in my first 18 months, I've made 33 trips to farm credit associations or farm credit meetings nationwide, and had this chance to speak at most of those and be engaged with them in a dialogue. I try to advocate with them about co-op principles, co-op values, providing dividends, and then with being involved in rural development.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit. I told you before we're going to get back to your family. You want to talk about your kids?
I have 2 sons, Keith and Joshua, and a daughter-in-law, Lindsay. And Keith and Lindsay got married over 2 years ago now. They met and debate. Both my boys are debaters, and Keith was a debater, and Lindsay is from Yankton. She was a debater. They debated each other, and eventually became close. And they both went to the University of Pennsylvania, and were students there. And then when they graduated, they got married. Lindsay is a law school student at the University of Minnesota, and she's in her final year, starting in another week. She spent the summer with us in Washington as an intern at a firm named Covington and Burling, and plans to work there after she completes a clerkship. My son Keith will be separated from her for 9 months because he is starting a PhD program at the at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and so for the next 9 months he'll be there on his first year of his PhD program while she's finishing law school. So we're really excited for him and for her both. Joshua is a student at the University of South Dakota studying political science and business, and he is very active with us in the farm, still goes out to the farm and works, and also spent the summer with us because he was interning with National Farmers Union. And so we're really pleased with his interest and involvement. And he also was the state debate champ in high school. So love my family, and we've had a great time together.
Looking around the state of agriculture in South Dakota today compared to your first involvement with cooperatives and so on in the 1970s, how would you evaluate it?
Dramatically different. I think we were in a time, I think, when we were in very depressed prices. We had much lower production levels in our commodities. We had a lot more farmers. I'm sure there was at least twice as many farmers when I was younger than there is today. And that loss has been dramatic and hurtful and destructive, especially for the small communities and in their decline that's occurred. We're still having to have strong financial supports from the federal government to be successful, even though the amount of commodities we produce has perhaps more than doubled the products. We're much more specific to a product, and that is the farms used to have a multitude of products we produce. Now we might produce 2 or 3 or 4 products off a given farm. So we're very specialized in what we produce. The bright side is we finally learned to go up the food chain, to process our products, to go farther, to try and add more value. The current explosion in ethanol has been deliberate and important and gone on for a very long time. So I think we're in a pretty good time right now in the fact that we're doing fairly well financially, I think, or better than we have done in some time. We've added to our ability to produce and to add value to products. I think we're, however, in a time of, it takes a long time to grow a farmer, and what I see is the people that are farming today were farming 20 or 30 years ago and have developed a huge cadre of confidence, experience, capabilities, and we aren't bringing along a cadre of people to do that. So we've lost a lot of farms, and we've lost a lot of talent. And I think we need to think differently about what farmers are these days, in the sense we need to think of them as artisans, as people with huge skills that are tremendous assets, and those skill levels we can no longer afford to see go away. And I think we have to treat producers as hugely important economic cogs in our rural areas. And I think until we start saying to people that it's an honor to be a producer, that it's important to America, it's important to the community, that we stop telling our children that the last thing you want to do is go farm. We have to get beyond that. We have to think differently about that, and I think that's just incredibly important. I think that's a difference today. We didn't treat producers as the assets that they are 20 years ago, that we should today.
What's your view on the current state of cooperatives in South Dakota, both of all kinds that you've had the chance to deal with over the years, which would include, I suppose, the rural electrics, the value-added, the traditional, and whatever else we may have?
I think that there's identity crisis to some degree that occurs in cooperatives. I think the best example we have of traditional cooperatives today is the rural electric system. They have a mission. It's to provide power to whoever you are, wherever you are. They've kept a focus on being cooperatives. in every respect. And I think that the rural electric system is in a good position and doing good work, and is very important to keep that stability that they have as a traditional cooperative structure. I think a lot of the traditional elevators, grain elevators, and marketing ventures that have been cooperatives are in a pretty good place. I mean, we have the individual co-ops out there that struggle to some degree, and then we have those that have combined together to form more of a chain elevator process. So I think there is a bit of a struggle in their minds about what their role is as cooperatives. I think our traditional regional cooperatives have struggled some, and I think the tide has turned a bit there, but I think for a long time they felt more like they were corporations and moving more towards a corporate role as just another corporation in rural America, and kind of struggled with that because they had a hard time accumulating the capital they needed to successfully compete in this world. I think the failure of the Farm Credit Services of America sale 2 years ago was kind of a tidewater turn. That up until that point, I think a lot of companies or a lot of cooperatives felt themselves being compelled to becoming corporations.
We're back again after a change of batteries. Dallas, I think you were talking about the state of cooperatives in South Dakota.
Yeah.
On that.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck. I think, as I was saying, I think that the failure of the Farm Credit Services of America proposed sale to Rabobank caused kind of a turn of the tide, in the sense that that cooperative board found out that its membership did not want to see its cooperative sold, and very firmly stated that. And I think that sends some signals throughout the cooperative community that producers still want the cooperatives to exist. I do think they understand that we need to make some changes about how cooperatives serve people and what the needs of some of the cooperatives are. But by and large, it needs to be understood that there's a democratic process involved with the creation of these companies. And I think the ethanol plants mostly have done a good job in how they've structured themselves by creating limited liability companies that look like and act like cooperatives, but that recognize that you need to have more capital to do some of the things we have to do that can be raised from producers. And so those ventures that have kept control by producers, that have kept a democratic process in place, but have allowed for some investment by outside parties to grow the capital they need to be successful, have made some sense. And so I think we're kind of in a time of transitioning. I think we need to keep traditional cooperatives in place where they make the most sense in providing services for people, but I think at times we have to add some new elements to the way cooperatives are structured in order to make sure we can bring adequate capital to serve those needs. And so we're in a transitional time with cooperatives. I think if we keep a focus on our traditional values in serving rural Americans and look for ways we can do that without compromising too much on our values, then we'll be well served.
Would you describe yourself as an optimist or a pessimist?
Yeah, well, my first reaction is, I'm an optimist. I think, our heritage drives us, and having grown up with our parents who went through the dirty 30s, always weighs on our backgrounds a little bit, in some ways very rightfully. I think we have to be optimistic that we can create and grow our own and control our own futures. I think we have to, you have to be optimistic, and you have to step out and take risk. And we have to start rewarding people who take risks and stop criticizing them so much for trying to do things. And sometimes that's painful. Some projects that develop fail, and you lose some money when you fail. But I think the worst thing you can do is, after a project fails, is to quit and say, I'm just not going to do that again. You have to learn from it, and you have to take the next step, and you have to go do it again. And it's just like planting a crop every spring. If you get hailed out the previous year, you can't go into the next spring thinking, I'm not going to plant. You just have to keep moving forward. You have to make decisions. So I think, yes, I am an optimist, but I think we've got to stop calling the people who are not optimistic. We have to stop critiquing them too much. We have to encourage them and get them excited and bring them along. And sometimes the best person you can put in charge of something is the guy that critiqued it the most, because suddenly they have to become optimistic and have to move forward.
Is there anything you would like to add that we haven't talked about that is burning in your?
I think I appreciate the thoroughness of your interview, Chuck, that you've done today, and I appreciate the questions you've asked. As I said earlier, I hope you get the chance to be interviewed soon by somebody so you can get your own interview done. I can't really think of things to add other than I hope the Farmers Union continues its long heritage of growing ventures in rural America, of supporting producers, that it steps up to the plate time and time again to make sure that we can collectively be independent producers that serve and get to be part of the land. And I think the only thing I want to add is I hope Farmers Union is here another 100 years from now, still engaged in rural America. So thank you for the interview, and I'm glad you're doing this project.
We've been visiting with Dallas Tonsager. Thank you for participating in the Cooperative Legacy Project. Legacy Project. Legacy Project. Legacy Project. Legacy Project. Legacy Project.